Hi, I'm Kent Mayor Dana Ralph, and I'm joined today by our Chief of Police, Ralph Padilla.
Good morning.
We are going to talk a little bit today about some of the new police reform laws that came out of this last legislative session. They're pretty significant, and they will have an impact on the way our police department is allowed to interact with the community. And we wanted to be able to explain to you some of the places you'll see a difference in how our department responds, and in some cases, how they are not allowed to respond to particular situations that we have seen them in before. So want to just really talk through these reforms. There's going to be changes, and we felt it was important to have the community be educated around this reform. Chief, we're going to talk today about police tactics and some of the things that came out of those tactics bills, specifically the impacts. And let's start with sort of the baseline. When do these laws go into effect, and how is the police department managing all of these changes?
Yeah, so it's a daunting task. Most of the bills go in effect 90 days from when the governor signs them. So for our timeline, most of these will go in effect in July 25th of this year. Some of those bills went into law immediately, and some will be enacted in coming years. So we have a lot of work to do in a very short time. So we're working on it. To that point, our time frame has already begun. Last week, we met statewide with almost 300 representatives from law enforcement across the state at the Sheriff's and Police Chiefs Association, WASPIC. During that conference, cyber conference, we went through all the laws and started getting to some universal understanding of what this means. And the goal being that we want the state law enforcement agencies to have very similar protocols, policies, and standards so that there's uniformity throughout the state and people know what to expect wherever they go. So that's a big deal for us. We're working on that. I want it noted very strongly to our community that our first priority is still to keep everybody safe, and that's not going to change. I have 132,000 people in our city, and we will do everything we can to maintain the level of service they expect. But at the same time, I think it's important that we talk about expectations and what's going to change. Certainly, we've seen this before. Law enforcement is used to new laws every year, case laws that come out of courts. And so we are used to adjusting and being flexible on how we do things. I will say, though, this is probably more change all at once than I've ever seen, but that's okay. And the last thing is, Kent Police Department was already operating in compliance with many of these, what are now new standards. So that's great. We were out ahead of the curve for a lot of these. And for the things we didn't adjust to prior to the new laws, we've anticipated that, and we've already enacted many of the changes. So our work product for Kent Police is probably maybe 10% of what maybe some other agencies have to do.
Nice. I love the idea that across the state, departments are getting together to set those standards, and so that everybody's sort of operating on the same playing field. And also, I'm very proud of our department for being out front on some of these issues, and then the commitment to meeting these new requirements. I think it's important for our residents to know that professionalism exists and will get there. And I also think it's important that they understand what the real impacts are, because there's a few of these things, I will tell you, took me a little bit by surprise in the things that a department is able to do in the course of keeping the community safe, right? And that needs to continue to be the backdrop of everything is that community safety. So thank you for being a leader on these things. Let's talk about police tactics. Can we walk through some of the changes and more specifically the impacts on service? So what are our residents going to see as these things are enacted?
Right. So probably the most paramount legislation is House Bill 1054. We've referred to it as the tactics bill. I think even the media has called it the tactics bill because it does impact a lot of the operational components of how we do our job. So I'll walk through that real quick so everybody can get an understanding. The law now prohibits chokeholds and neck restraints, which is not an issue for us. We put a restriction on that almost a year ago now. It requires the Criminal Justice Training Commission, which is basically the entity that's responsible for the basic law enforcement academy, corrections training, and all law enforcement training. It requires them to develop a model policy for canine applications. And so we've got more good news on that. Commander Chris Mills has already been in touch with the commission, and he will be one of the subject matter experts being used to weigh in on how canine applications will be done throughout the state. So Kent PD specifically will be at the table for those discussions. Very excited about that.
I love the fact that we are part of those regional conversations, those statewide conversations. It matters.
Right. The other next thing on the list is prohibition of tear gas. And so tear gas use is restricted in a lot of ways, but it does allow for use during riots in prisons, riots out on the street, and for certain tactical situations where, say, we have a barricaded armed subject in a building and we're trying to get him to come out and surrender, it's allowed in that regard, and a couple other applications. More good news on this. This represents virtually no change for the Kent Police Department. So we meet all those standards currently. The only kind of big change, Mayor, is that you get to be directly involved now. So if we find ourselves in a place where we have a riot outside of a jail, say on our streets here, the mayor will be the one authorizing use of tear gas, and I will be in consultation with her for that. So it bans the use of military equipment, not an issue. We don't even have any military equipment to report, but some agencies may have, and so it bans that. Requires that officers be readily and reasonably identified at all times. So this means having either a name badge on your uniform or some kind of identifier like a serial number on your badge. Kent, we don't use serial numbers. We go straight with names on our, and you will see that that's no change for us at all. Restricts vehicle pursuits. Now, here's where the big changes come in. In a synopsis, it restricts vehicle pursuits in almost all circumstances, and that includes some of our serious felony violent crimes. So, because it elevates the requirement for officers to conduct a pursuit from what we call reasonable suspicion, which means I have more likely not think that this person is involved in the crime. That's a layman way to explain it, to probable cause, where now I have evidence that more likely than not, this person should be arrested for the crime. Two different standards. It does allow for us to stop cars based on reasonable suspicion for DUI, so that's a good thing. And now the officers have to justify or articulate, in addition to having probable cause for an arrest, that the pursuit is necessary because the person driving or getting away poses an imminent threat of safety to the community.
So let's stop on that one, Chief. So not just that they have committed some sort of crime, but the concern has to be that they're headed out to commit another crime, or explain what that standard means.
So imminent is defined as a person having the opportunity, the means, and the intent. Okay. Right? So think about that for a second, and to bring it to a practical sense, I have to show that the person, the offender getting away, I have to be able to give specific reasons why I think that person is now going to hurt somebody else. So commit a second crime. Right. Okay. Right. And so I can give you an example if you'd like.
Yeah, that would be great.
So let's say, for instance, we have a officer is out on patrol, sees a vehicle, runs the license plate for that vehicle, and a hit through the crime database comes back that vehicle is associated with a murder suspect. Right? The officer is not in position to clearly see the driver and get a real good look at him, but generally speaking, the driver matches the description of the person wanted for murder. Under the old law, that is reasonable suspicion for a stop. It's still reasonable suspicion today. But what's different is if the officer goes to stop that car to investigate and see if this is the warrant murder suspect, then if the murder suspect then flees, says, I'm not going to stop, takes off.
I'm not stopping, I'm going to keep going.
The officer is at reasonable suspicion. He does not have enough to arrest that person because he can't confirm the identity of the driver. And so for that reason, the officer may have to be in a position to allow that murder suspect to leave. Okay. Imminent comes into play. So take that same scenario. Murder suspect wanted. There's an arrest warrant signed by a judge. Now, let's say the officer this time can visibly verify that the person in that car is the person who's wanted. Say we got pictures and we match them up. Okay. So now we have probable cause. Okay. Good news. Here's the other kicker, though. Now I have probable cause. The second thing the officer has to show is that imminent part, right? Imminent threat. So let's say that the murder is for a murder from 5 years ago. Let's say it's a cold case. And now the suspect takes off when the officer tries to stop him. It's going to be very difficult to show that there's an imminent threat from someone who committed a murder 5 years ago. And so in that circumstance, again, the officer may have to let that person go.
So many scenarios to contemplate and policy to build around these kinds of things.
Yeah, and again, the time frame in which the officers have to make
those decisions,
right?
Yeah.
They're very condensed. The law 1054 also prohibits firing at moving vehicles unless the officer has no alternative. And the way we're working for our legal advisors to define that further. But what it looks like is unless the officer is getting run over and cannot get out of the way, the officer is prohibited from firing at a car. It bans no-knock warrants, which are, we've not used no-knock warrants in Kent for at least 2 decades. So again, not an issue. And that's, those are kind of the highlights of the bill. There's other parts to it, but those are the ones that are most concerning, I think, to the public.
Okay. So we've started down this path a little bit on elaborating on some of the major impacts with that scenario that you gave us about the pursuit. Can you help us understand a little bit more what the major impacts of these changes that you just described?
Yeah, I think it's important to note, and I want to say it's not our role to really, advocate for or against legislation. In law enforcement, we have the laws that are handed out, and our job is to adapt them, operationalize them, and then enforce them. So I want to make that clear. At the same time, managing expectations. So property crimes, so say burglaries, those are no longer things that we can pursue for. We can't pursue for misdemeanor DV assault. So if officers are responding, they have probable cause to arrest someone for DV assault, it's not on the list. The law is very narrowly tailored, and they're described as violent crimes, but that's not the common knowledge of violent crime, and what's in the actual statute are not the same thing.
So domestic violence.
Misdemeanor domestic.
Okay, so maybe help us understand the difference there.
Yeah. So if it's domestic violence in which the injured victim doesn't sustain injuries that are serious or substantial injuries, so like broken bones, loss of consciousness, anything that falls lower than that is a misdemeanor, gross misdemeanor, and so that is not listed in the RCW currently. Hopefully there will be some modifications because I think that may not have been one of the intents, but currently that's how the law reads.
Okay.
So that's kind of legal street racing. This is going to be an interesting. Now, the public may not know is that generally we don't pursue for illegal street racing. However, in some of these circumstances, illegal street racing also comes with felony level hit and run accidents and major injuries and or shootings. And so we're going to have to really work through how we can adapt this, right? So illegal street racing's on there, and some other, property crimes. One of the ones that happens on a regular basis is people fleeing from, say, commercial burglaries.
Mm-hmm. You've got a witness that's called in and said, this is the car, this is the person, they're going away. As long as they start to flee, speed, drive away, then our officers are then required to step back. And what does that look like then does that person just get away with that crime? Or there's got to be more process to that.
Well, we're not going to, they're going to get away in the moment, but we're not going to stop our efforts to solve the crime and get justice for the victims, right? So what that means is we will move significantly from a proactive approach to law enforcement to a reactive. And we're going to have to get really, really good at letting a person go today and then going back and doing the extensive work of finding them, establishing a case, and maybe putting a case together later for arrest and prosecution. It is far easier when we can get the person right there,
right.
But we're going to get better at doing it after the fact. So our investigative skills are going to need to be enhanced. I think a lot of people may think that, this may mean less resources are needed by the police. And the reality is it takes far more time, work hours, and staff to solve a crime after the fact than when it's actually occurring.
Yeah, I'm definitely thinking that we will need more detectives. There's more paperwork involved, all of those things. And it does feel a little bit counterintuitive to, I see the person that committed this crime and not being able to pursue them and arrest them in the moment, because in my mind goes to then they have an opportunity to commit another crime while we're establishing that case and doing that detective work.
It very much cuts against the grain of what most police officers want to do. Most police officers want to stop that person, want to do the investigation, and want to make sure that the process is completed. And so there will be some significant cultural changes, but we will make sure we're in compliance.
Thank you, Chief. This is really helpful information. I am extremely proud of the fact that our police department is on top of this and these changes that have come out of the legislature. I think there are things in these bills that are good, and I understand the purpose behind them. I also will be honest and say I have some concerns about the impacts on community safety. The thing I don't have concerns about is our department's commitment to keeping our community safe. And so I want to say thank you for that and your thoughtful approach to how we implement these changes that came out of the Washington State Legislature in this session. I want to let the community know that this is just the beginning of these conversations. As we work through details and put in practice this new legislation, we will continue having these conversations through a variety of different formats, videos, public events, as we move out and start gathering again. So opportunities to help you understand what we're doing and make sure that you have a chance to ask questions of us. So thank you, Chief, for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mayor.